Millionaire tries to evict his ex-wife. What she shows the judge stops everything. Have you ever witnessed the kind of courtroom drama that leaves everyone speechless? Picture a man of immense wealth, a penthouse perched high above New York City, and a long-standing marriage suddenly ending in a bitter dispute. In this story, our millionaire protagonist sets out to evict his ex-wife, believing her to be powerless only for a shocking secret to surface in front of the judge. Prepare for a roller coaster of deception, unexpected alliances, betrayals, and a twist that will have you questioning who the real victim is. If you think you know how this will end, think again. The evidence she reveals changes everything. Leonard Addington had always carried himself with a stately, confident air. At 47 years old, he was tall, athletic, and possessed the refined handsomeness that came with age and status. Owning a string of luxury car dealerships across the country, Leonard had earned the moniker the Luxury King. He was regularly featured in business magazines, praised for his savvy expansions and philanthropic causes, though many who worked beneath him whispered that Leonard's generosity was more a branding tool than genuine kindness. He had met his ex-wife, Sophie Hastings, nearly 2 decades ago at a charity gala in Boston. Sophie was a vibrant presence in any room. Her dark, wavy hair framed an expressive face, and her laughter was contagious. They'd fallen in love quickly, at least Sophie believed so. She was an aspiring artist at the time, painting murals and small canvases for local exhibitions. They wed in an extravagant ceremony at the Waldorf Astoria, surrounded by high society guests, caviar, and champagne that cost more than some people's annual salaries. Their union was, for many years, stable on the surface. Sophie eventually gave up her artistic ambitions to support Leonard's career. She managed the household and participated in carefully orchestrated public appearances, presenting the image of a charitable couple. At business openings, Sophie would stand next to Leonard, smiling gracefully as she cut ribbons or posed for photos. In private, Leonard grew to resent her aspirations. He would comment that her little paintings were best left as a hobby, never missing a chance to remind Sophie that if she were truly talented, she'd already have made it big. Tensions built. Late-night arguments flared up over the slightest misunderstandings. Leonard complained about expenses for the simplest things, as if Sophie's presence was a financial burden. Sophie, on the other hand, felt suffocated, her self-worth withered more each time. Leonard snubbed her passion for art. Eventually, the marriage collapsed under the weight of bitterness and contempt. The official divorce papers came on a Tuesday afternoon, an unceremonious arrival for a life-altering event. Despite her initial shock, Sophie conceded that it was best to finalize matters quickly. Except she soon discovered Leonard had begun to manipulate the financial aspects of their separation, leaving her with significantly less than a fair settlement. The house in Greenwich, Connecticut, valued at millions, was put in his sole name right before the divorce, an underhanded move orchestrated by Leonard's formidable team of lawyers. The business interests, once half promised to Sophie, seemed to vanish into a labyrinth of holding companies and trusts. For a time, Sophie tried to confront Leonard's legal advisors, but they brushed her off with carefully worded letters. She could have pursued more intense legal action then, but the emotional drain and cost of an extended court battle nearly paralyzed her. Instead, Sophie attempted to move on with her life. She rented a modest apartment in Manhattan, gave art lessons to children at a local community center, and tried to find peace in each brushstroke of color she laid on canvas. Yet, Leonard wasn't finished. The house in Greenwich, which was rightfully his after the manipulated settlement, became a matter of obsession for him. Because it was an emblem of success and stable family life, he felt its presence was an unwanted reminder of his past. He decided he wanted to sell it, or even better, demolish it, and build a new modern mansion that reflected his reinvigorated bachelor lifestyle. The only problem? Sophie still spent weekends there. She considered it her marital home, believing she retained some rights, no matter what the legal documents claimed. So Leonard set his plan into motion. He would evict Sophie, citing that she was trespassing on property he now solely owned. Once that was done, he would have free rein to do as he pleased. And if that left Sophie with nowhere else to go on weekends, that was hardly his concern. Leonard's carefully curated public image, his impeccable suits, and his business accolades covered the ugliness beneath. But that ugliness was about to be exposed in a court of law for everyone to see. Sophie Hastings woke up to the harsh beep of her phone alarm in her small Manhattan apartment. She stretched and glanced around the room, the chipped paint on the walls, the second-hand furniture she'd picked up at a discount store. It wasn't grand, but it was hers. Peaceful in its own way, it represented her attempt to stand on her own 2 feet. She had no idea that her ex-husband's lawyers had filed a motion that very morning to have her forcibly removed from the Greenwich estate. By midday, a plain envelope arrived, slipped under her door by the building's mail carrier. Inside was a summons and complaint. Leonard was taking her to court, claiming she was illegally occupying his property. He demanded immediate eviction and threatened to press trespassing charges if she continued to visit. Panic washed over Sophie. That house meant so much to her, not just as a building, but as the last tangible reminder of the life she had once built. She felt her eyes sting with tears she refused to let fall. Though she had accepted the divorce, she had never agreed to be humiliated like this. There had to be something she could do, some loophole or piece of evidence that would protect her from Leonard's reach. She considered contacting various law firms, but her savings were meager, and big city attorneys didn't come cheap. Still, she had a few connections from her philanthropic days. Even though she didn't move in the same high society circles anymore, she hoped her name would still carry some weight. After a series of frantic phone calls, she secured an appointment with an old acquaintance, a small-town attorney named Carla Winfield, who had once served as a junior lawyer in Leonard's firm. Carla had since branched out on her own, building a reputation for tackling complex family law cases. Later that afternoon, Sophie stepped into Carla's modest law office. There was no gleaming lobby or well-dressed receptionist, just an old wooden desk, some chairs that had seen better days, and a stack of files leaning precariously on a shelf. However, Carla herself exuded a calm authority, wearing a tailored suit, her hair pinned back in a neat bun. "It's good to see you," Carla said, extending a hand. "I just wish it were under better circumstances." Over the next hour, Sophie poured out the entire story, from the manipulations during the divorce to Leonard's cunning legal maneuvers. She recounted how the house ended up solely in Leonard's name through shadowy financial transactions. Carla nodded sympathetically, scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad. When Sophie finished, Carla pressed her lips together. "There may be some wiggle room," she said, "but I need more details. Specifically, any original agreements you might have, or any documents that show your contribution to the property, even if it's something as simple as home improvement receipts or anything that predated the divorce. Did Leonard ever sign anything acknowledging your share in the property?" Sophie stared at her hands. She had a faint memory of Leonard, during a more affectionate time, signing an informal statement that recognized Sophie's investment of her inheritance toward the down payment when they first bought the Greenwich estate. "I think I have something like that," Sophie replied quietly, "though it's old and might not be notarized. But it's definitely his signature." Carla's eyes lit up. "Well, old or not, it could be a starting point, especially if we compare it with any traceable financial records." Sophie left the office feeling slightly lighter, a sense of hope peeking through her distress. She called her friend Maria, who lived on the outskirts of the city, and asked for help rummaging through the boxes of personal items. Sophie had stored there. Among dusty photo albums and old diaries, maybe, just maybe, she would find the key to fighting Leonard. In the coming days, Sophie would uncover far more than an informal promise. She would stumble upon something that would send shockwaves through the entire case, something that, if presented at the right moment, would bring Leonard's grand eviction scheme to a screeching halt. Leonard prided himself on efficiency. He was methodical and left little to chance. Seated at the long, polished mahogany table in his high-rise Manhattan office, he conferred with his team of attorneys. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Central Park. It was a luxurious space that symbolized how far he had risen. His lead counsel, Richard Sterling, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, laid out the strategy. "We've filed the motion to evict Miss Hastings. She has 30 days to respond. We'll push for an expedited hearing. Once the judge rules in our favor, we can get a court order to have her removed." Leonard tapped a Mont Blanc pen against his notepad. "And we're sure we're covered? No hidden loopholes that could derail this?" Richard smiled. "We've triple-checked everything. The property is solely in your name due to the transfers executed before the divorce was final. Unless Miss Hastings can prove some form of joint ownership that was excluded from the divorce settlement, she has no legal standing." Leonard stood and walked to the window, arrogance radiating from his posture. "Good. This house is nothing but an eyesore. I want to sell it to a developer or tear it down myself. Let's be done with it." Turning back to his team, he added, "And if Sophie tries any of her sentimental nonsense, do whatever it takes to silence her." Meanwhile, Sophie was rummaging through storage boxes at her friend Maria's small garage. Dust motes floated in the stale air as she opened each box labeled with marker paintings, wedding mementos, old letters. She had almost given up hope when, at the bottom of a battered cardboard container, she found a folder with some crucial paperwork. Inside were older documents, receipts for a portion of the Greenwich property's down payment money Sophie had inherited from her grandmother. Even more important was a handwritten note from Leonard, the edges yellowed with age, stating that he acknowledged Sophie's financial contribution to the purchase. Sophie remembered how, in the early loving days of their marriage, Leonard had jokingly scribbled the promise, insisting it was a symbol of our unity, even though it wasn't official. She had kept it for sentimental reasons, never imagining its potential importance. But that wasn't all Sophie found. As she sifted through more papers, she came across a set of documents she didn't even recall possessing. They detailed a separate investment account under her name, opened by Leonard early in their marriage for rainy day funds. The statements showed deposits that Leonard had made, which over time had grown substantially. Sophie stared at the account statements, confusion turning to realization. For years, Leonard had quietly funneled money into an account in her name, perhaps to keep certain funds off his business ledgers. It seemed like a small fortune was hidden away. This discovery was shocking enough, but the final piece of paper sent her heart pounding. It was a record of a property transaction in the state of Nevada, a modest piece of real estate that had once been used as a tax shelter for Leonard's business. Her name was listed as a joint owner, along with Leonard. The connection was clear. If Leonard had used Sophie's name on properties for shady tax advantages that might become a legal landmine for him if exposed, Sophie pressed a hand to her mouth. She realized the gravity of what she held in her hands, tangible evidence that Leonard had manipulated their finances in questionable ways and recognized her financial involvement in multiple properties. If she brought this to light, it could disrupt not just the eviction case, but possibly open Leonard to scrutiny for how he handled his business ventures. She gathered the documents and rushed back to Carla Winfield's office. Carla's eyes grew wide as she examined each piece of paper. "This changes everything," Carla said, her tone hushed. "With these documents, we can argue that you have a rightful financial interest in multiple properties, including the Greenwich estate. Also, Leonard might not want all these hidden transactions going public. He has a reputation to maintain." Sophie felt a surge of resolve. Leonard had backed her into a corner, assuming she was powerless. But now she had a weapon of her own, one that might make him think twice before pushing her out of what was once their marital home. With new evidence in hand, Sophie began to sense a flicker of empowerment she hadn't felt in years. The eviction hearing date was set in a modest family court, one that rarely saw the wealth and prestige that Leonard typically flaunted. On the day of the hearing, the weather was grim, heavy clouds hung low, mirroring Sophie's simmering anxiety. She clutched the folder containing the old note, financial statements, and property records. Inside the courtroom, Leonard's legal team was out in full force. 5 attorneys in pristine suits occupied one table, their laptops open, legal pads at the ready. Leonard himself sat at the center, checking the time on his expensive Patek Philippe watch, a gift he had once boasted about acquiring during a trip to Switzerland. At the opposite table, Sophie sat next to Carla, who organized her notes and evidence. A wave of self-consciousness hit Sophie when she noticed the difference in scale. She had one lawyer on her side, whereas Leonard had an entire battalion. Yet, Carla's calm demeanor and the weight of the documents they had brought instilled a measure of confidence in Sophie. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Bernadette Lasky, entered the courtroom. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, and her presence immediately demanded respect. After the formalities, Leonard's lead counsel, Richard Sterling, presented his case. He spoke in crisp, polished sentences, outlining how Leonard was the undisputed owner of the Greenwich property. According to the divorce decree, Sophie had no legal claim or right of residency there. When Carla stood to speak, she introduced the new evidence. She first showed the old note acknowledging Sophie's financial contribution. The attorneys at Leonard's table shifted uncomfortably. Next, Carla presented the financial statements from the hidden investment account. She pointed out how Leonard had placed funds in Sophie's name, arguably indicating that Leonard himself recognized some sort of shared asset arrangement. Finally, Carla hinted at the Nevada property, holding back the full extent of its implications for strategic purposes. The moment the Nevada property was mentioned, Leonard's composure faltered. His clenched jaw gave away his tension. His attorneys exchanged concerned glances. Suddenly, the eviction case was no longer a straightforward matter of who owned the Greenwich home. There was now a question of undisclosed marital assets, potential financial misrepresentation, and even tax implications if the property transfers were not above board. Judge Lasky's eyes narrowed as she asked Leonard's side for clarification. Richard Sterling attempted a strategic retreat, claiming that these documents were tangential and not directly related to the eviction. But Carla seized the opportunity, arguing that these new findings cast doubt on the legitimacy of the property arrangement. "I need time to review this," Judge Lasky said, eyes flickering between the two parties. "Given the complexity here, I'm issuing a temporary stay of eviction until we can determine the rightful ownership interests in question. Miss Hastings will not be removed from the property at this time." A small, victorious smile tugged at the corner of Sophie's lips. Leonard, on the other hand, looked as though someone had yanked the rug out from under him. The judge's decision effectively froze his attempt to kick Sophie out. Instead of an easy victory, Leonard now faced a new and daunting possibility. The skeletons in his financial closet might be dragged out into the light for everyone to see. Outside the courthouse, the media was waiting local reporters who'd caught wind of the high-stakes family drama. Cameras flashed as Sophie and Carla hurried down the steps. "Miss Hastings, how do you feel about the judge's ruling?" asked one reporter. "I'm just grateful for a fair chance," Sophie managed to say, her voice trembling slightly from the adrenaline coursing through her. She clutched the strap of her handbag with whitened knuckles, eager to get away from the prying lenses. Leonard stepped out moments later, flanked by his legal team. His expression was stony. When questioned, he offered a terse statement about confidence in the legal process, then swept into a waiting black SUV. The crowd of onlookers, however, noticed his uncharacteristic silence. The mogul, who often boasted about his philanthropic endeavors, now seemed eager to dodge attention. With the temporary stay in place, Sophie was free to return to the Greenwich estate, at least for the moment. The drive out of the city was surreal. In years past, she might have traveled this route with Leonard in a luxury car, returning to their sprawling home after a charity gala or a weekend in the Hamptons. Now, she navigated the highway alone in her modest sedan, heart pounding with a mix of relief and trepidation. When she arrived at the grand driveway, her eyes settled on the familiar facade. Ivy had crept up part of the brick exterior, and the lawn seemed less manicured than before. It felt like stepping into a memory that was simultaneously comforting and painful. Inside, remnants of her past life lingered in every corner, the luxurious furniture she had once painstakingly selected, art pieces on the walls. Some were hers, small paintings she had gifted Leonard in their happier days. She walked through the rooms, letting each memory wash over her. The emptiness of the house was haunting. Most of the staff had been dismissed after the divorce. Leonard deemed them unnecessary expenses. Upstairs, in what used to be her art studio, she flicked on the lights. Dust particles floated in the air. Canvases stood stacked against the wall, covered by white sheets. Carefully, she pulled the sheets away, revealing paintings she had almost forgotten existed, abstract swirls of color, nature scenes, a portrait or two. These represented the parts of herself she had repressed for so long. Could she revive that creative spark? She resolved that she wouldn't let Leonard take this place from her without a fight, not only because of the financial ramifications, but also because it symbolized her own journey. If she could stand her ground here, maybe she could stand her ground in her life as well, her art, her independence, her sense of self. Meanwhile, Leonard was locked in heated discussions at his Manhattan office. "What do you mean you didn't know about the Nevada property?" he snarled, pacing the polished floor. His attorneys exchanged wary looks. Indeed, the existence of that joint property had been kept so discreet that even some members of his team were unaware. If Miss Hastings can prove you were funneling funds secretly and that she has legitimate ownership stakes, this could open up the entire divorce settlement to re-litigation, Richard Sterling said, removing his glasses to rub his eyes in frustration. Leonard's temples throbbed. He understood that this wasn't just about the Greenwich estate anymore. If Sophie pushed this further, he might be forced to disclose business practices he had taken pains to bury. Doing so could jeopardize not only his finances, but also his carefully curated public image. His philanthropic persona would crumble if allegations of financial impropriety went public. Despite his fury, Leonard remained steadfast in his plan. He wanted Sophie out of that house and out of his life. But for the first time, he feared she had found a powerful way to fight back. Pride and desperation mingled in his mind, fueling a reckless determination to win at all costs. The days that followed were a whirlwind of strategizing and maneuvering. Carla, recognizing the magnitude of what they'd discovered, approached Sophie with a plan. She wanted to expand their legal response beyond the eviction issue. If Leonard insisted on moving forward with the eviction suit, then they would counter by petitioning the court to re-examine the entire financial settlement from the divorce. Such a move was bold, potentially explosive. Are you ready for that kind of war? Carla asked Sophie in a hushed tone during a late-night phone call. Leonard's going to fight this with everything he has. It could get ugly, very ugly. Sophie took a slow breath, staring at the paintings stacked against the wall in the Greenwich house. I know, she said, but I'm tired of being bullied. We can't just fight half-heartedly, right? Carla was silent for a moment, then agreed. Right. If we do this, we have to go all in. Across town, Leonard was trying to plug the holes that threatened to sink his carefully built empire. He summoned Richard Sterling and a new associate named Helena Cruz, a sharp litigator known for her ruthless efficiency. Leonard wanted them to uncover any dirt on Sophie, anything that could be used to discredit her claims. Helena wasted no time. She delved into Sophie's background, her online records, even her social media postings from years back. She discovered Sophie's new circle of artist friends, her involvement at the community center, and any mention of her finances or lack thereof. But what Helena found was disappointing from Leonard's perspective. Sophie appeared squeaky clean. She had no criminal record, no suspicious dealings, no shady business partners. Her financial situation was exactly as she'd claimed, humble, almost too transparent. As they searched for a weak point, Helena did stumble across a snippet of information. Sophie's mother had lingering medical debt from her late father's hospitalization. Perhaps, Helena suggested, the threat of burying Sophie in legal fees could push her to settle. Leonard latched onto this idea. If Sophie was already financially stretched, maybe the fear of her mother's debt piling on top of personal legal costs would be enough to break her. Meanwhile, Sophie and Carla filed a motion not only contesting the eviction, but seeking a full review of all marital assets and properties that Leonard had manipulated. It was a bold move, one that required the judge to decide whether the existing divorce decree might have been based on incomplete or misleading financial disclosures. If that could be proven, the entire settlement could be thrown out, forcing a new division of assets. The day the counter-motion was filed, Leonard's lawyers responded with a barrage of letters, motions, and legal intimidation. Each demanded volumes of paperwork from Sophie, seemingly designed to overwhelm her. Carla received requests for Sophie's entire financial history, personal emails, phone records, anything that could be used to trip her up. Yet, Sophie remained resolute. If they want to drag me through the mud, she told Carla, let them. I have nothing to hide. But I guarantee Leonard is the one with the dirty secrets. Sophie's unexpected fire took Leonard's team by surprise. Gone was the demure, hesitant woman who might have buckled under pressure. Each new demand from Leonard's side was met with calm defiance. And with each passing day, the possibility grew that Leonard's hidden dealings would spill into public view. Unbeknownst to Sophie, her bold stance was beginning to sow discord among Leonard's own allies. Some of his business partners grew uneasy, not wanting their names entangled in potentially scandalous revelations. Banks and investors watched warily, concerned about negative publicity. Leonard could sense the walls closing in, but he was too proud to back down. His determination to crush Sophie overshadowed the risk to his reputation, setting the stage for a showdown that promised to be disastrous for one side or both. As the legal battle escalated, Sophie discovered a powerful ally she never expected. Laura Street, James, a seasoned financial investigator who had once worked for Morgan Stanley, approached Carla's office after hearing rumblings of Leonard's financial tactics. Laura had a reputation for cutting through complex money trails, especially in high-net-worth divorce cases. She also harbored a personal dislike for Leonard, stemming from an incident years earlier where he had publicly humiliated a former colleague of hers. Carla, eager for any advantage, introduced Sophie to Laura. In a cramped conference room, the investigator laid out what she had gathered. Leonard's business network spans multiple states, with shell corporations used to shuffle money around. It's not necessarily illegal, but the lines are blurred. If he's been using these setups to hide assets during divorce proceedings, that's a serious violation. Sophie listened, a mixture of fascination and apprehension in her eyes. She had never delved deeply into how Leonard managed his empire, but she knew his ambition had no bounds. Now, it seemed that ambition had led him to tread on legally dubious ground. Meanwhile, Leonard was busy orchestrating a new scheme. Realizing that direct intimidation hadn't deterred Sophie, he turned to emotional manipulation. Through an intermediary, he sent word to Sophie's mother, insinuating that Sophie's legal fight might cost her family dearly. If the case dragged on, the costs would skyrocket, and any assets Sophie had might be seized or exhausted in the process. Sophie's mother, alarmed by these tactics, pleaded with Sophie to consider a settlement. "Is it really worth it?" her mother asked over the phone, her voice trembling with age and worry. "I don't want to see you crushed by debts and stress." For a moment, Sophie felt the old panic rise in her chest. But she recalled the dusty canvases in the Greenwich Art Studio, the glimmer of pride. She felt after the first hearing the sense of self-worth blossoming again. She refused to let Leonard's threats dictate her future. With Carla's reassurance, she held firm. Laura Street. James had an idea. They would issue subpoenas for Leonard's shell corporations, combing through each for any undisclosed marital property. If Leonard had placed Sophie's name on multiple assets, like that Nevada property, he could be in real trouble if he tried to keep it hidden during the original divorce. It took weeks of grunt work, scanning documents, cross-referencing addresses and financial statements. Late nights blurred into early mornings for Sophie and Carla's small team. Coffee cups littered the office, and the overhead lights buzzed like a mocking reminder that time was marching on. Yet, the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Leonard had not only hidden property, he had engaged in questionable tax strategies that, if exposed, could attract attention from federal authorities. For Sophie, the discovery was sobering. She had suspected Leonard was unscrupulous, but never to this extent. Fear mixed with indignation. She worried about the potential blowback if Leonard realized how close they were to unveiling everything. But deep down, a spark of defiance continued to guide her. No matter what, she wouldn't let him bulldoze her again. As the second hearing date approached, a hearing that would determine whether the court would fully reopen the divorce settlement, tension rippled through both camps. Leonard doubled down, meeting with new attorneys, political connections, and even hiring a PR consultant to manage the potential fallout. Sophie, for her part, found a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, she felt like she was fighting for something beyond just property. She was fighting for her own dignity and autonomy. The morning of the second hearing arrived, and the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Unlike the initial eviction hearing, the press presence had grown noticeably larger. Word had spread about the possibility of financial misconduct involving Leonard Addington, the so-called luxury king. Reporters speculated on what fresh drama might unfold inside Judge Lasky's courtroom. Sophie, dressed in a simple yet elegant navy blue dress, entered with Carla by her side. She tried to appear composed, but her heart thumped wildly. She caught a glimpse of Leonard standing with his lawyers. He wore a tailored suit, face set in a hard line. Their eyes met briefly, a silent battle of wills across the bustling corridor. Once everyone was seated, Judge Lasky called the session to order. Carla presented new evidence, carefully unveiling documents that linked Leonard to a series of undisclosed properties and offshore accounts. Each piece of paper was laid before the court, each property address and financial transfer meticulously highlighted. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as onlookers leaned forward, straining to catch every detail. Leonard's lead counsel tried to dismiss the relevance of these findings, arguing that they were unrelated to the original divorce. But Carla pressed on, explaining how these hidden assets directly impacted the fairness of the divorce settlement. If my client's name appears on these properties, it demonstrates a pattern of deception, she stated firmly. We have reason to believe Miss Hastings was entitled to a far larger share of marital assets than was disclosed. Judge Lasky looked down at the documents, frowning. Mr. Sterling, she addressed Leonard's attorney, can you refute these claims with any documentation of your own? Richard Sterling cleared his throat. We believe Miss Hastings was aware of these assets from the start, he said, though his voice wavered. If there is any discrepancy, it's due to administrative oversight. Carla seized the moment. Your Honor, there is also a concerning pattern of possible tax evasion here. Should we proceed to formal discovery, we may need to involve financial oversight bodies. A hushed gasp rippled through the crowd. This was more than a messy divorce. This was potentially criminal territory. Leonard's face darkened, and he exchanged quick, anxious glances with his legal team. The possibility of an external investigation was the last thing they wanted. Judge Lasky took a measured breath. Given the seriousness of these allegations, I'm inclined to grant a motion to reopen the financial proceedings of the divorce. That means we will pause the eviction proceedings until we determine the scope and distribution of all marital assets. Sophie felt a surge of relief, so intense that she nearly forgot to breathe. Leonard, on the other hand, looked thunderous. His jaws flexed, and his gaze bore into Sophie with barely contained fury. Outside the courtroom, the press clamored for statements. Sophie managed a brief comment. I have faith in the justice system to uncover the truth. She didn't mention how her knees felt like jelly or how she craved the sanctuary of her former art studio. Leonard brushed past the reporters without a word, storming into a waiting town car. Inside, he erupted in anger at Richard Sterling. This is spiraling out of control. We need a strategy to shut this down before it ruins everything. But even as he seethed, Leonard couldn't ignore the tightening knot in his stomach. For the first time, he realized that if he continued on this path, the fallout could be catastrophic, not only for his finances, but also for his public persona. In that moment, any lingering sentiment he might have held for Sophie turned to bitterness. She was the adversary he'd never expected, the one person who now stood between him and the empire he'd carefully constructed. In the weeks that followed, the court ordered formal discovery. Documents had to be exchanged in full, and both Sophie and Leonard were required to provide sworn statements. This phase of the legal process turned into an all-consuming affair. Carla, along with Laura Street James, pored over every page, every bank statement, every contract. Leonard's camp grudgingly complied, sending over files that were often heavily redacted or presented in a disorganized manner, clearly intended to frustrate the investigation. Still, certain patterns emerged, paper trails leading to more hidden assets than anyone had initially expected. Sophie spent most of her days at Carla's office, helping sort through the stacks of paperwork. She felt exhaustion tug at her, but also a strange sense of accomplishment. With each new revelation, she realized how systematically Leonard had tried to erase her from the financial narrative of their marriage. He had wanted her to remain a footnote, a minor accessory. Instead, she was now front and center in a battle that had grown into something much bigger than a simple eviction. Across the city, Leonard's tension escalated. Already, a few of his business associates had stepped away, worried by the potential scandal. Investors began calling, demanding explanations. Rumors swirled about the possibility of federal scrutiny for tax irregularities. To maintain a semblance of control, Leonard implemented a sweeping PR campaign showcasing charitable donations and philanthropic events. hoping positive headlines would overshadow the legal drama. But behind closed doors, he felt cornered. One afternoon, Leonard received a phone call from a man named Harold Chambers, a high-profile real estate developer with deep political connections. "Leonard, you need to settle this," Chambers advised bluntly. "The more you fight, the more dirt surfaces. If you go down, you might drag the rest of us down with you." Settling, however, meant conceding to Sophie. The mere thought made Leonard's blood boil. She had been a quiet partner for so long, he couldn't stand the idea that she might gain anything at his expense now. Still, the chorus of voices urging him to cut his losses grew louder. That same week, Carla and Sophie were stunned when they discovered a critical piece of information regarding the Greenwich Estate's purchase. The initial down payment from Sophie's inheritance had actually covered nearly half of the property's value at the time, not a negligible amount, as Leonard's lawyers had claimed. Coupled with Leonard's own signed acknowledgement of Sophie's contribution, this could place her in a potent position to claim a significant share of the property. Sophie felt a whirlwind of emotions, validation, anger, relief. All those times, Leonard belittled her as a freeloader or someone who never worked. He had known. She had poured her savings into their home. While she wrestled with these feelings, Carla pointed out the legal implications. If the judge sees this, it won't just be about evicting you or not. It could mean the property is at least half yours, if not more, due to appreciation over the years. Word of these developments reached Leonard's ear, prompting another flurry of emergency meetings with his legal team. "We need an out," Helena Cruz insisted. "If we keep pushing for eviction, she'll push for a full property claim, which she might win. Then we're stuck with a meltdown of your finances in court." Leonard's internal conflict intensified. Accepting a settlement that let Sophie keep part of the estate was a bitter pill to swallow. But was losing everything, including his reputation, worth continuing the fight? Despite the pressure to compromise, Leonard remained obstinate. He considered an alternative plan. If he could undermine Sophie's credibility somehow, the entire case might collapse. Yet every potential scandal he uncovered proved insufficient. Sophie was unassailable in that regard, leaving him grasping at straws. Time was running out. Another hearing was scheduled, one that would decide whether the Greenwich house would remain off limits for sale or demolition until the final asset redistribution. If Sophie won, Leonard risked more than just a single property. He risked the unraveling of his entire empire. The stage was set for a final confrontation that promised to shake both parties to their core. The Greenwich estate had been quiet for months, largely unoccupied except for Sophie's weekend visits and short stays during the discovery process. One evening, as twilight draped the property, Sophie settled in the living room, a pile of paperwork spread across the coffee table. She glanced occasionally at the massive windows overlooking the sweeping lawn. Once upon a time, she had admired this view with Leonard, dreaming of a future that now felt like a different lifetime. A gentle knock on the door startled her. She wasn't expecting visitors. Opening it, she found Leonard standing there, alone, hands shoved into the pockets of his overcoat. The last person she expected to see, and certainly not unannounced. An awkward silence stretched between them before Leonard cleared his throat. "We need to talk," he said, his voice subdued. He stepped inside, glancing around as if assessing how much had changed. Truth be told, the house held an air of neglect, reflecting the turmoil overshadowing both their lives. They settled in the living room, facing each other from opposite ends of the couch. Leonard's once impeccable grooming seemed to have faltered. The circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. Sophie remained guarded, wary of whatever trap this might be. "You're going to destroy me," Leonard said bluntly. "This entire court battle, it's spiraling. Investors are pulling back. My business partners are skittish. And you," he paused, searching her face, "you've gotten the upper hand, and it's not just about the house." Sophie's pulse quickened. She had rarely seen Leonard in such a vulnerable state, but she remembered how many times she had been manipulated by his words. She steeled herself. "Leonard, I didn't ask for any of this. You came after me. All I wanted was to keep what was rightfully mine." He let out a bitter laugh. "You think this is about fairness? Fine. Let's be fair. You invested in this place. So I'll offer you a deal. Take a cash settlement, a substantial one, and sign over your claim to the house. I'll drop the eviction suit if you drop the financial investigation." Sophie's jaw tightened. He was essentially asking her to walk away. Let him bury the skeletons again. She thought of all the nights she'd cried herself to sleep in her cramped apartment, the times she had to scrape together a living while he thrived off the wealth she helped him build. Now he wanted to buy her silence. She swallowed. "I'm sorry, Leonard, but I can't. Not anymore." His demeanor flashed with anger. "Why not? Isn't money what you want? Think of your mother's medical debts. Think of your own future. You can paint, travel, whatever you want. All you have to do is sign an agreement." Sophie stood, summoning her courage. "It's not just about money. You used my inheritance for this house. You lied. You hid assets. You tried to evict me. And now you want me to let you off scot-free while you continue living like none of it matters. I can't do it. I need closure. I need justice." Leonard rose as well, for a moment appearing as if he might lunge forward in fury. Instead, he clenched his fists at his sides. His voice trembled with suppressed rage. "You'll regret this," he said. "The courts, the media, they'll all turn on you eventually. Don't think they won't." Without waiting for a response, he stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Sophie stood in the echo of that departure, her heart pounding, tears burning behind her eyes. For a split second, she questioned whether she had made a mistake turning down his offer. But a deeper conviction echoed within her. This was bigger than a paycheck. It was about reclaiming the respect and autonomy she had lost. The final showdown arrived in a tense courtroom, brimming with lawyers, reporters, and curious onlookers who had followed every twist of this sensational case. Judge Lasky presided with a solemn expression, clearly aware of the gravity of the day's hearing. The central question now was whether Leonard had engaged in financial deception significant enough to invalidate parts of the original divorce settlement and ensure Sophie's stake in the Greenwich property. Carla and Sophie presented their case with painstaking detail. They outlined how Sophie's inheritance had covered nearly half the property's down payment. They pointed to Leonard's own written acknowledgement, the hidden investment accounts, and the Nevada property jointly owned, all of which Leonard had failed to disclose. They even hinted at potential tax irregularities, but Carla chose to focus on how these undisclosed assets affected Sophie's rightful share. Leonard's legal team fought back, attempting to question Sophie's motives. They insinuated that she was deliberately dragging Leonard's name through the mud for personal gain. But their arguments wavered under the weight of evidence, which was meticulously organized and verified by Laura Street James. Every time Leonard's counsel tried to dismiss a piece of paperwork as irrelevant, Carla countered with matching statements, signatures, and financial transactions that told a starkly different story. Finally, Judge Lasky leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Mr. Addington, I need to hear from you directly. Did you, or did you not, disclose all assets during the divorce proceedings as required by law?" Leonard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his arrogance tempered by the judge's authority. "Your Honor, there were numerous properties, investments. Perhaps there was some oversight, but I never intended to deceive anyone." His carefully chosen words were met with a stony silence. The tension in the room was so thick that everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the judge's next words. Intentional or not, Judge Lasky said slowly. "This court is deeply concerned about the possibility that Miss Hastings was shortchanged during the divorce settlement. The evidence suggests a pattern of undisclosed assets that directly impacts her rightful share of marital property. Therefore, the first am ruling to reopen the financial distribution of the original divorce decree." A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing Leonard's clenched jaw and Sophie's stunned relief. Judge Lasky wasn't finished. "Regarding the Greenwich estate," she continued, "based on the documentation provided, it appears Miss Hastings has a substantial interest in the property, possibly exceeding half, given her initial investment and the appreciation value. Until final resolution, I'm placing an injunction preventing any sale, demolition, or transfer of ownership. Miss Hastings may continue to occupy the premises lawfully." A sense of triumph washed over Sophie. She had never truly believed she'd get this far. Across the aisle, Leonard's face was ashen. The court had effectively sided with Sophie, halting his grand plan to evict her and possibly forcing him to concede a huge portion of his assets. As the gavel struck, the room erupted in a flurry of noise. Reporters swarmed, demanding reactions. Carla guided Sophie through the throng, a proud smile on her face. Leonard, surrounded by his own attorneys, refused to speak, pushing past microphones and cameras toward the exit. But the final blow for Leonard was yet to come. Even as he left the courthouse, phone notifications buzzed with alarming updates. Stock prices in one of his major ventures had plummeted after the news broke, and an IRS official had reached out requesting a meeting to discuss certain financial irregularities. His entire empire quivered at the prospect of a deep dive into his business dealings. Sophie stood on the courthouse steps, exhaling a breath she felt she'd held for years. Justice, or at least the promise of it, was finally within reach. And in that moment, the hardest chapter of her life shifted into a new beginning, one she would shape on her own terms. The weeks following the ruling were a flurry of legal negotiations. Sophie, with Carla's counsel, began the painstaking process of recalculating the division of assets. The Greenwich estate, once a symbol of her broken marriage, now held the promise of a fresh start. Carla's preliminary estimates suggested Sophie would gain a considerable sum in backdated entitlements, plus official joint ownership of the property if she chose to keep it. Leonard's legal team worked furiously to contain the damage. Offers for an out-of-court settlement poured in, each proposal more generous than the last. Though the settlement numbers soared into amounts Sophie had never imagined, she remained cautious. She had one final request that was non-negotiable, a full public acknowledgement from Leonard that she had contributed significantly to the Greenwich home and that he had wronged her in the original divorce proceedings. When Carla conveyed Sophie's condition, Leonard exploded in rage. "She wants a public confession?" "No way!" he shouted in a tense meeting with his lawyers. But as the days wore on, with federal investigators hovering and his public image tarnished, Leonard realized he might have no choice. The alternative could be a drawn-out court case that risked criminal charges. Reluctantly, he agreed. A carefully worded statement was drafted. It was by no means a heartfelt apology, but it was a public admission that Sophie had been entitled to more than she received and that he had erred in not disclosing all assets. When the statement went live, the media pounced on it, presenting it as a shocking reversal for a man who had built a career on unshakable confidence. Meanwhile, Sophie stood at a crossroads. Should she keep the Greenwich estate, renovate it, and try to reclaim it as a place of peace and creativity? Or should she sell it, using the proceeds to forge an entirely new path for herself? During a quiet evening at the estate, she wandered from room to room, letting memories surface, the good, the bad, and everything in between. She paused in her old art studio, where the dust-covered canvases still stood. In that space, she realized that while the house held a piece of her history, she was no longer defined by it. In the end, Sophie decided on a middle path. She would keep the house for now, but transform part of it into an art retreat, a place where she could teach and host fellow artists, perhaps even run workshops for underprivileged youth. Her settlement funds would be enough to finance renovations, and it felt like poetic justice to turn the opulent structure into a space brimming with creativity and community. On a brisk morning, Sophie stood on the porch, sipping tea, as contractors arrived to begin the first phase of renovations. She noticed how the morning light cast golden rays across the yard. The shadows of her past were long, but they were receding. She had emerged from this brutal ordeal not just financially secure, but with a deeper sense of self-worth and purpose. Leonard, in contrast, faced the cold reality of his actions. Investigations into his financial dealings continued, and though he still possessed significant wealth, the chinks in his armor were clear for all to see. Business associates distanced themselves, and he was forced to downsize. Ironically, his attempt to evict. Sophie had evicted him from the comfort of unchallenged respect he once enjoyed. The karma he had courted returned full circle. As Sophie watched the workers unload their tools, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Carla, confirming that all final settlement details had been approved by the court. A sense of closure settled over Sophie's heart. The war was over. The future was hers to shape. And, in the comforting hush of that morning, she quietly celebrated the dawn of a new life. One through resilience, courage, and an unyielding belief in her own worth. Thank you for watching this roller coaster of deceit, determination, and ultimate justice. Sophie's journey reminds us that no matter how powerful the adversary seems, standing up for what is right can turn the tide. Sometimes karma comes knocking when you least expect it, and for Leonard, it wasn't just a knock but a full-blown reckoning. If this story resonated with you, please help support our channel by hitting the like button, sharing this video with friends who love a dose of dramatic twists, and subscribing to stay tuned for more captivating tales. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you stories of triumph, moral lessons, and unexpected twists. From everyone here, thank you for being part of our community. Stay strong, stand your ground when faced with injustice, and remember sometimes, the biggest victories are the ones we fight for in our own hearts. Have a wonderful day.